Okay, and the other thing that you alluded to a minute ago, and you wanted to come back to it, that really kicked in '82 was reapportionment. And I'd like you to talk about that, exactly what your role was, the Chamber's role, and what happened in 1982.
My first involvement with redistricting was back in 1979. I was part of a study group that Senator Bill Cederberg, a senator from East Lansing, put together on redistricting. And frankly, for me, it served as a tutorial on how redistricting works and the law of redistricting and things like that. And with a friend of mine, a state senate staffer at the time, Al Mann, who would later go on to be a pollster for Marketing Resource Group, he and I kind of put out a publication that we called the Citizens Redistricting Plan. And it talked to, about, having an acceptable population margin and then keeping counties, cities, and townships together. And so that was my initial involvement with redistricting. In 1982, Michigan had a Commission on Legislative Apportionment that was to do state legislative redistricting. It was made up of 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats from 4 different geographical areas of the state, and it always deadlocked. And because it always deadlocked, the state Supreme Court would be thrust into the position of choosing a plan submitted by 1 or more commissioners that was the most constitutional. Tom Brennan, when he was on the Supreme Court, wrote in an opinion that constitutionality is like pregnancy. Either you are or you ain't. And one of the first forays I had into judicial elections came in the 1980 election, and I knew that Mary Coleman was up for election that year, and so the Michigan Chamber's PAC actually made a contribution to her. It wasn't a substantial amount, but it was the first time we had ever made a Supreme Court contribution, and I knew that she was likely to be the key to developing some sort of consensus on redistricting. And in 1982, Mary Coleman was in fact the Chief Justice. And in a
but wasn't it still a Democratic-controlled court at that point?
Well, it was 3-3-1
With Charles Levin.
Charles Levin was the one.
Yeah.
He was the independent.
Yes.
And although he shares a famous last name with Carl and Sander,
Right.
And votes pretty much like a Democratic justice.
Right.
On this issue, we would find that
he was willing to be reasonable.
Yeah, and we also had another Democrat on the Supreme Court that had been punished by the Democrats, and that was Thomas Giles Kavanaugh. He had voted against the Democratic plan in 1972, this Hatcher-Kleiner plan that I talked about. And so when he was up for re-election the next time, I think it was in '76, the Democratic State Convention nominated Roman Gribbs for the Supreme Court. Well, Thomas Giles Kavanaugh filed an affidavit of incumbency, got his name on the ballot, and was reelected to the court. So there were a number of people that basically wanted to get the state Supreme Court out of this political thicket.
So you had a chance in '82 with the court that you didn't have in '72, or for that matter, long before you came to Michigan, '64, when you had a Democratic Supreme Court, and they always seemed to pick the Democratic map that was drawn and given to them. But finally in '82, what happened?
Well, the time ran out. The 180 days had expired, and the commission was prepared to submit a Republican and a Democratic plan to the court, and the court basically sent a communication back to them and said, we want you to brief the issue of whether, in fact, with all of these U.S. Supreme Court decisions, that in fact this Commission on Legislative Apportionment is any more, and the other provisions in the Constitution that provided for, let's say, the Senate on an 80-20 ratio of area to population, whether they survived. And so, the briefing was done. The state Supreme Court basically ruled unanimously that the Commission on Legislative Apportionment was invalid, but in the interest of the continuity of elections, we're going to appoint a special master to draw a plan for House and Senate districts, and then we'll give the legislature this date certain, sometime in early May, to pass a plan that would have immediate effect, that would be given immediate effect, meaning a 2/3 vote in both the House and the Senate, and the governor sign it, and only then will we let the legislative plan go into effect. Otherwise, this plan that Bernie Apel, who was a recently retired director of elections, the plan that he draws and will submit to the court in advance of this deadline will go into effect. Well, when Bernie Apel did his plan, and the plan was basically, there was an acceptable population margin. Actually, it was plus or minus 8.2%. It said that counties are the basic building block for creating districts. And if it was necessary to break a county boundary line, you break it at a city or a township boundary line. And they thought that that was the best guarantor against, partisan gerrymandering. And so when the Republicans looked at this plan that Bernie Apel had drawn up, they had absolutely no incentive to cut a deal with the Democrats. And so the Apel plan was into effect for the 1982 elections. One of the things that occurred in the 1982 elections, Jim Blanchard was elected governor. The state Senate remained Democrat, but only 20-18. And the state House, the Democrats still had solid control, but the margin was reduced from 70-40 to the Republicans might have got up to 46 seats or something like that. But, that kind of changed the whole landscape of the legislative of elections, because the Apel plan was no longer some partisan gerrymander. It was basically one that, although the Democrats did well with it, the Republicans had a fighting chance.
Well, for that matter, the two seats that the Republicans had the recalls in and won the special election were created by the Apel plan,
That's
right?
correct.
And they were marginal seats,
Yeah.
and then the Republicans won the special election, got control of the Senate, and they've never given it up.
Now, one thing that comes out of the 1982 election, because it deeply influenced me later on, was that in 1982, as far as the Supreme Court, as far as the congressional districts was concerned, the Republicans really had no money, and so they had to rely. Bill Milliken was able to get the Republicans and Democrats on the Commission on Legislative Apportionment that only did the state legislature, some sort of state funding. And I know the Republicans hired Bob Teeter, and they came up with a computer to help them draw, district lines. These weren't desktop computers, these were kind of mainframe computers. But as far as congressional redistricting, which was done by the state legislature, not by the commission, Republicans had to rely upon a pro bono lawyer, and there was absolutely no money for any expert witnesses. And Republicans got their clocks cleaned in federal court. And I think after the '82 election, the margin was, I think, 12 Democrats and only 6 Republicans in the congressional delegation. In 1983, the night of David Sorokin's recall, the legislature reconvened in Lansing, and what the Democrats did in the state Senate is they discharged a bill that had been sitting in the Senate Municipalities and Elections Committee that had already been passed by the House. It was a multi-section bill making some housekeeping changes to the Michigan election law. And what they did is they adopted that night a Senate substitute that redrew 110 state House districts and 38 state Senate districts. And I remember that night because I came back to the state capitol from an election watch party and sat up in the gallery and watched Joe Mack appear to have suffering a heart attack, but he refused to leave the floor of the Senate, and the EMS came in and they put oxygen in his nose and an IV and that sort of stuff, and he remained there to the end and gave him the 19th vote to pass this redistricting